Hello everyone, welcome today to Mike's SPSS Tutorial 1. This is a little different from the usual SAS tutorials I present to you, but I have a colleague who's requested an SPSS tutorial, so I'm doing this for her and for you all. Today I'm going to cover just the very basics of the SPSS environment and what you'll be looking at when you're working with SPSS. So here in front of you is SPSS as you would see it when you first open it. You have this dialog that asks you what you would like to do. It's a very simple menu driven system here that will help you to get started right off the bat. Personally, I don't like to work with it, so I ask not to show this dialog in the future because I like to jump straight into the program. Initially, SPSS will ask you to open a data set, and if you have a SPSS .sav file, you can open up your SPSS dataset and work with it right away. Now, in working with SPSS, most of the time you will be working in this data editor window that has two views. It has this data view, which allows you to see everything like an Excel spreadsheet, and it has this variable view, which allows you to see a listing of all of the variables in your dataset. Now, if you're working with previously created data, obviously this will be a lot more full than this blank, brand new data set that I'm working with here. And you're going to see the names, the type of variable, some labels, hopefully, and the measure of the variable. I'll get into that in a little bit. I just want to call your attention here to the data view and tell you that when you're creating new data sets, you can start inputting your data right away as you're going through it. And SPSS will automatically start filling in this listing of variables for you. However, bear in mind that here for the variable name, it's going to give it a very generic var 00001 name and automatically try to figure out what type of variable it is. Here it's classified it as a numeric variable. If I go into my data view, for example, and start typing in some names, let's say Amanda, Mike, Maria, Nate, and Eric. Then in the variable view, now you'll see that its type has turned into a string variable and its measure has become a nominal variable type. So what essentially was an ID variable and a name variable were automatically created by SPSS. And in working with new data, this can be a very powerful way to start inputting data from the get-go. However, bear in mind that when you're doing this, it's not necessarily the cleanest and most efficient way to do it. Sometimes you're going to want to spend a lot more time dealing with the variable view first and specifying exactly what your variable names are and what their labels are, what their types are, and what their measures are. Because when you have a clean data set, one that has all of this information for you, it's going to make working with SPSS a lot more easy for you in the future. And this is one of the primary reasons why most people like to work with SPSS, is because it's so easy. Now, of course, I specified here that it was an ID variable and a name variable. So let's say these were patient records. I could say patient ID and patient, let's say, first name here, so that we knew that these two variables represented the ID and first name. Now, of course, I want to make sure that it's a numeric type for the ID, and a string is just a series of characters or alphabetical values, so that you know exactly what that variable's type is. The reason this becomes important is when you're working with the SPSS and you're doing analyses, obviously you want to work with numeric type variables for statistics that are going to be running on numeric. Let's say like you wanted to get the means of a variable for height or age or something of that nature, you're going to want to make sure that you're running it on a numeric type of variable. Whereas if you're doing some kind of categorical system, you want to make sure that you're doing it on a string or some kind of classifying variable. So this is the data, this is the variable view, this is the data view, and it's very simple, very straightforward. Now let's say you wanted to do some very basic frequencies. You can use the menu system up here, edit, view, data, transform, analyze. This is where most of your action with the data is going to happen, and it's mostly going to be with this analyze menu. There's a lot of information to be covered with this menu, and more information will be covered in later tutorials. But for now, for the most basic of tutorial, let's just go ahead and do a analyze descriptive statistics frequencies. And I want to do it on the patient ID and the patient name. Now it's going to be I guess lackluster here. I mean, we're going to have 5 frequencies. We're going to have one coming up each time, so it's not going to be that impressive. But once I've input the variables that I want the frequencies for, I can say OK. And here in a new window now, this new output view, this new output window, we can see our frequencies for our data set have come up. And it's going to say that for well, there's going to be several different tables that will come up. And in the first one, we have the statistics, the sample size, the number of valid values that came up, and the number of missing. Since we only have 5 rows here, or 5 observations, we don't have any missing data. But when you have a larger data set, you should expect to have some missing data, unless it was very cleanly entered or very well taken care of data. So here's our first frequency table for our patient ID, and you can see here that patient ID wasn't the name of the variable, which was ID, it was the label. And that's why it's important sometimes to make sure every variable has a label here, because when you come up with these tables, it's going to be a lot easier to read. So here we have valid number of observations. For the 1 value, we had 1 frequency. For the 2 value, we had 1 frequency, and so forth. Now, of course, for IDs, you'll want to, unless you're dealing with some kind of repeat that every ID is. So here we had a total of 5 IDs that were in our data, and the percentages are also listed here in this frequency table. And for the first names here as well. So if you were dealing with some other data set, let's say some kind of I don't know, birth records data, and you wanted to see how many people were named Amanda, you could see that come up, and you would see a lot more than just 1 frequency. So this is the output window, and this is where you're wanting to, it's similar to the SAS output window, where what you run from your main editor will show up in a different window so that you can browse through it really easily. Now if you're dealing with Windows 7 like I am, you can just toss this to the side and toss this to the side, and now you can see them side by side. And that's what I like to do when I'm working with it. One last thing to point out here is that this data view is very simple for inputting data, but the variable view is a lot more is a lot better to work with when you don't necessarily want to start doing your data entry, but you want to plan out what your study is going to be like. So let's say this, of course, is dealing with patients. Let's say this was a birth certificate data set. I want to have some kind of ID, some name, maybe have L name for a patient's last name, and specify that the type is going to be a string. I can specify the label, patient's last name, and I want to also include mother age. Oh, excuse me. You have to also make sure when you're dealing with the variable name itself that you don't include any kind of space. It's considered an illegal character or illegal variable name. So oftentimes when you want to include a space, it's better to use a underscore. So let's say mother underscore age, and again specify now that this is going to be a numeric variable, mother's age. And let's say for the decimal places, we're going to put 0. Now, it's important when you're dealing with large data sets, I mean on the order of millions of patients, or millions of observations, records, whatever, that you have to specify the width and the number of decimals. This becomes really important in the size of the data set. I mean, sometimes you can have data sets that are on the order of several gigabytes, and you don't necessarily want to deal with such a large data set, because when you're giving it to somebody else to analyze, or if you're getting it in an email or something, it can be really large and it can take up too much space. Now the width here is the number of spaces it's going to take up, and so I don't think you can have anybody who is 9 digits of age old. So let's say 3. I mean, you might have somebody who is in the hundreds of years old, maybe they're not necessarily going to be having children at that age, but you're going to have the mother's age there, and it can, if this was a dynamic data set, it could possibly get to the hundreds of years old. So the one last thing I want to point out here is the measure type, and you want to make sure that you're using the right kind. There are only three. There's scale, ordinal, and nominal. And the reason I want to say that you want to make sure that this is the right type is because when you're dealing with an analysis, it can be very it can save you time and errors down the road if you're using a scale, ordinal, or nominal measure type, because the way the statistics work, you're going to sometimes come up with errors if the measure is incorrect, and it's better just to keep it sorted right away. So that's just a very simple, very straightforward way of looking at SPSS, and hopefully in the future I'll have more videos for you so that you can see, so you can get started in working with it right away. Alright, well, thank you so much, and have a good day, and look forward to the next video. Thank you.